is what Nietzsche's saying, right? He wants us to recognize the final dot on the final page of that book. And that book is our life story. It's over here. If you don't want to believe that narrative, there's no problem in turning the page and creating a new story. You might come back, and you have narratives of reincarnation. You might go to live in heaven, and there's narratives of heaven in various degrees, Valhalla in various degrees. For those who have done bad things, you flip the page, and you might go to hell and suffer for infinity and for eternity, and there's narratives for that. All that's being said is, I'm telling a story, and I'm letting you know, when we get to the bottom, there's going to be a period, and it's going to be death. And at that point, you should be comfortable with the fact that the story is over. If you're not, then this isn't a story for you. You need to look into other traditions that tell you about what happens after. This narrative is going to end, and we know how it's going to end. This is the foreshadowing. This is the plot spoiler. Spoiler alert. I just spoiled it. Number 5. On the other hand, it is only this desire. It ought to be. It is only this desire, it ought to be, that has called forth that other desire to know what is. It is the desire to know what ought to be, our ethical considerations, that calls into question what is. Remember, we look beyond existence towards what ought to be. Right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be transcendent. Right? This is the point. Our narrative, Nietzsche's narrative, is a narrative that says, you know what ought to be? We ought to live in a society where individuals who don't have access in the United States, everywhere else in the world they seem to figure this out, we ought to live in a society in the United States where our medicine and medical health can be provided for those who can't provide for themselves. It ought to be the case. I don't need to rely on any transcendental figure, not disrespecting them, but I don't need to rely on that. Talk to the scientists, talk to the pharmacists, talk to the politicians, talk to various sectors of government and society, and let's see how it works. They seem to be doing it in Europe pretty well. Let's look at their model. Let's try to replicate their model. Let's make their model better. Let's make our own model, right? It's not that I'm against Pfizer, GlaxoSmithKline, the huge multinational pharmaceutical corporations for making ridiculous profit. You're an egoist. I would be completely contradictory to say that you shouldn't be out there trying to make money. Make money. But who is it hurting? To try and also provide for those people who don't have. They're not mutually exclusive, right? So you can, from a logical standpoint, argue the point. I don't have to appeal to transcendence. I can make this world a better place and do it. This is Nietzsche. I can make this world, and partly me, I can make this world a better place and do it without having to appeal to anything outside of this world. And also recognizing that my appeal is an appeal from an egoist to an egoist. We're on the same team here. I just don't happen to want what you got. I don't need the Benz. Why? Because I have this. This is what I want. Right? I want this. I want ours. I want demonstrated proof that I work. I want it to be here so that when I die, there's no question that I made a contribution. I want to see my work. You might not want that. You might want $1 trillion in your account. You might want gas to go to $200 a barrel. If that's what you want, that's what you want. I'm not trying to tell you what you should or shouldn't want. All I'm saying is, as an example, there has to be a relationship and a recognition that insofar as we talk about this ought, it doesn't have to be outside. But insofar as we talk about this ought, it doesn't have to be transcendent. We're looking over that which is. So in a sense, the desire that I just articulated of, let's say, medicine for, I want to say socialized medicine, because as soon as you bring up socialized, everybody goes freaking crazy. There's too many idiots in the world. There are far too many idiots in the world. But as soon as you bring, a more socialized medicine, a medicine that provides for people who can't provide for themselves. In order to talk about that ought, that ethical consideration in egoistic, naturalistic, secular terms, we have to recognize the relationship to what is, the epistemological, our understanding of what is. So the point is then for number 5, right? For knowledge of what is, in consequence of that question, how is it possible? Why precisely so? So I think I should say it somewhere here. I'm going to get right to the point. Sorry, state of peace. I'm going to skip that real quick. Yeah, I don't think I say it right here. I'm going to have to tell you the point now because, yeah. So the idea is, in order to discuss ethics, and I probably should have made this more clear here, we got to go to it through. This is just a suggestion, right? We want to talk about what ought to be the case. A-O-U-G-H-T. But here's what is the case. How do we know what is, right? Epistemology, right? So the relationship between the two, and I'll read Nietzsche, and again, the quote directly, so that you can see this relationship. On the other hand, number 5 again, it is only this desire, thus, it ought to be, that has called forth, that desire, that it ought to be, has called forth that other desire to know what is. For the knowledge of what is a consequence of that question, is a consequence. He uses the term consequence, right? For the knowledge of what is a consequence of that question. Right? How is it possible? Why precisely so? So, now that you understand that, let's go to the idea that I've demonstrated before. Here's a perceiver, and what ought to be the case is a state of peace. Right? So here we are, and you might say that we want to arrive at a state of peace. No, state of peace is like that. That's a Mercedes-Benz sign. Or you might want to arrive at a Mercedes-Benz, right? So here is the state of peace. But here is the case. This is what we ought. This is what ought to be. And here's what is. Combat. Number 6, thus, for example, we desire, right? We desire a state of peace without properly understanding what is. Right? We desire to make sense of conflict resolution without really understanding what is conflict. Good conflict resolution and a good conflict resolutionist has to be properly trained in understanding the nature of conflict. Right? If I attempt in any sense to resolve conflict, I need to understand the nature of conflict. Right? And this is demonstrated best at the beginning of Western philosophy. Plato engages the general. He doesn't talk to anybody else. He doesn't talk to the blacksmith. He doesn't talk to the priest. He talks to the general. Right? Tell me about this idea of fairness. Tell me about this idea of justice. Tell me about how do we make sense of this? He asked the general. Of all people, why in the world would you want to know that from the general? Because the general is in the best position to tell you about that, right? Because the general has an understanding of combat, of conflict, as manifests. Who better to tell you about the nature, the conditions in which we can come to make sense of resolution to that conflict? Now, to be fair, the general is wholly unconcerned with conflict resolution because he loses his identity insofar as you attain resolution, but you need to think like the general. If you're a conflict resolutionist, then your eyes should be focused on conflict as the general's eyes would be focused on conflict. If you're a forensic psychologist and you're attempting to track a sociopath, you had better assume the mind state of a sociopathic, psychopathic serial killer in order to be able to catch that person. You can't transform, right? You can't transform the relationship between what ought to be the case and what is the case without recognizing that you have to embrace this duality. There is a duality of oppositions that needs to be embraced, and he'll talk about this later. Right? There isn't a sense in which you can go from is to ought that threshold, you have a threshold problem. There's a specific point where what you wanted actually becomes the case. The is turns into ought. How does that happen? When does that happen? Where does that happen? What's that state of transformation? Nietzsche's going to tell us, right? He's going to tell us. And, I'm alluding to it a lot, right? Actually. I mean, it's sort of obvious. Peace as the goal of desirability without an understanding of a state of conflict merely serves to condemn existence. 6a, quote, the fighter tries to transform his opponent into his antithesis in imagination naturally. I transform my opponents into my antithesis. I come to identify myself in relationship to my opponent as the antithetical opposite of who I am. I'm A, you're not A. I do good, you do pure evil. Right? The fighter, the way that I engage my opponent is by transforming my opponent into my opposite. Nietzsche says, note 348, the fighter tries to transform his opponent into his antithesis in imagination. Right? Because we recognize in the real sense, there's so many similarities. You're a man like I am. You have desires like I have. You're a human being like I am. You have desires like I do. But in order to do what it is that I need to do, I need to transform via my imagination you into my antithesis. You are nothing like me. You couldn't be like me. And you're doing the same to me. He's nothing like me. He could never be like me. Now we can fight. Now we can understand sort of the groundwork for combat. And I'll return to this concept later in the series. Number 7 and 8. Morality prescriptions without epistemic, here's what I wanted to get to. Morality prescriptions without epistemic understanding, descriptive assessments of what is a means of condemnation. This is how we rebuke what is. This is how you deny what is. This is how you negate our embodiment in your desire to attain the ultimate, which is the perfect all, the all-encompassing state of perfection, is a wholesale denial of all of this. If there's anything that I embody, if there's anything that others embody who have risen to a particular level of expertise in their respective fields, in their respective professions, in their respective, what have you, hobbies and interests, it's a recognition that I can still get better. This can't be a state of perfection because I'm getting better every day, right? So there isn't a sense in which, right, there is this idealized perfection. Why? Because this is what is. Right? It's not a denial. Hence, desirability can and does serve as a means of condemning existence, as I said before. Okay, so now top of page 59.